Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming. It's a small but mighty group today, so it's like, yay. I'm Randy. These are my books. Big excitement, not really, but let's talk about prostitution and looking for love in all the wrong places, which is Sandy's title.
But I love the subtitle left to it. Oh, brothel, where art thou?
She was saying that yesterday, and that just went over the top of my head. I was just like, what the hell is she talking about? Anyhow, my basic premise is Colorado is not settled by temperate, well-adjusted people. So keep that in mind when you're all dealing with me. So if you're looking for the school teachers, the ministers, those aren't my people. This is a picture of Market Street in downtown Denver. This is what that brothel district looked like. There's no reason to assume that Pueblo didn't look about the same. I just couldn't locate any photographs of it. So I need to go into their history museum and their archives and see what they've got. So that would be a good thing to do next time I'm down there. But as you can see, there are, I wonder if this does this. There are girls in the doorway who are soliciting. You know, and any man who is driving down, like on his bicycle, which we still see in Denver today, it can be 3 feet of snow and people on bicycles are still going by. It's like, the more things change, the more they stay the same. They could pretty much expect to get propositioned. I don't really think people weren't just down there without a purpose, shall we say. So, this is Denver. When we think about settling the Colorado Territory and who was actually doing the settling, was an interesting thing. I always learned growing up there, like, so many more men than women. And I'm like, well, when I was working on my book, The Bad Old Days of Colorado, I wanted to look and see what assumptions that we always held, were they true or were they not true? Some things weren't true, but this one was like surprisingly true. When the first census was taken in 1860, there were 32,000 people. 31,000 of those were men. Okay, so that leaves 1,500 females with a ratio of 20 to 1. When you start drilling down in the age groups, it gets a little bit more pronounced that the men are aged 20 to 30 is 17.6 thousand to 520 females. That gives you a ratio of 34 to 1. And throw men in 30 to 40, there's 10,000 men to 278 women, a ratio of 38 to 1, which really means there weren't enough dance partners to go around. So, the women who came out who were selling their flesh, the flesh trade, they saw the niche in the market. I mean, these women knew what they were looking for. This was not like this wasn't an accidental happening in most cases. Sometimes something bad happened and a woman turned to prostitution.
You know, and in the Dobbs book that I was looking at last night that's all about Pueblo, one of the prostitutes amassed $100,000 and left the trade. Now, $100,000 in the 1890s is one.
That's
a lot of money.
That's 2.4 million because $1 US in those days was worth $24 today.
So I just thought that was really interesting, and she was shrewd and a businesswoman, which a lot of them were. Right. But that was pretty damn impressive.
It was, you know, it is really impressive what some of these women managed to amass. Here's the Sanborn fire map. So Sanborn Fires Company was an insurance company, and so they would plot out all these cities in the west to see where fire hydrants were, which were these black marks. Anyhow, I went through just to see who owned what property, just to get a feeling for how many brothels there were versus how many saloons, and I put some of the more famous ones in the map. So,
and weren't they designated as FBs?
Female boarding.
Female
so
boarding.
If you ever see FB, that means a brothel. Okay, so this is a picture I took in Victor, Colorado of the Fortune Club, and this is going up the stairs. So I figured a way to do this presentation would be what could be expected on a brothel visit, depending on which role you were in. Okay. From the customer side of the equation, you'd be paying for high-priced drinks. Beer that normally costs 5 cents would cost $1. Whiskey that normally costs 25 cents would cost $1 as well. And that's considered value pricing because the whiskey would probably pack more of a punch than the beer. One thing that everybody needed to know was whiskey. If you ordered whiskey, you probably weren't really getting straight whiskey. You might have a flavor of whiskey. They would cut it with like water, turpentine, strychnine, put creosote in it, rattlesnake heads. I don't know why they put some of this stuff in their booze, but it stretched it further, and people would pay this money. And so when you kind of go, oh, well, 25 cents wasn't much, well, that's like $7 today. So you're paying $7 for a really bad drink. If you went to, champagne might be available at the fancier establishments. I mean, I doubt it was real, I doubt it was from France, but yeah, right. Safety, I wouldn't count on it. There were health issues with the women. There was a doctor in Denver in the early days who thought that 3/4 of the men under 30 had some sort of disease. So they had health issues. There was problems with crime within the brothels. Just because you were there drinking and you were their customer didn't mean something bad wasn't going to happen to you. I mean, gamblers frequented these places, thieves frequented these places, and that doesn't even count for the theft that would occur within the people working there. So there were 3 main types of theft that was, like, say, inside of the brothel. A man called a creeper who would actually open the door to the girls' room, creeping along the floor while they were busy, and rifle the man's pockets. There was a man called a panel man or girl who would have a hollowed out space in a room, and while people were busy would come out of the woodwork, literally, and steal money. And then there was the hook artist, and I live in an old 1890s building, and you know, they have transoms. And so a guy would stand out with like a fish hook and be fishing through the transom, but the girl was in on the whole thing, and she would make sure that her customer put his pants in a very specific spot so the guy could like hook him out, go through the pockets, and then hook him back in. And of course he never hit the chair again, right? And so the girl would be just as mystified as her customer when the guy's pants were in some weird location. It's like, how did that happen? No idea. So you kind of had to watch out for that. Some of the stories I have heard did involve murder. One guy from Golden went down to a brothel in the rougher part of the street, and he actually ended up murdered. I don't know if he did something to cause it, but it was quite surprising. Here's some pictures of the madams. They weren't exactly what I expected, because I kind of grew up in the era where I thought everybody was going to look like Miss Kitty Steve Bondi. This used to be one of my bosses. Hi, Steve.
I bet he's here at 7 after.
Yeah, just about. Yeah, very good. So these women aren't exactly what I thought I'd be looking at. So they weren't like the plumed people with like the sequins or the fancy dresses so much, but they did have really fine clothes. So they were well dressed. You'll see the one from Pueblo, which is probably one of the more spectacular ones. The one in the middle is Maddie Silks, who's the most famous. Jenny Rogers is on this side. She was considered the classiest, but we still have a story about that. And the larger woman was Lou Bunch out of Central City. And Lou left life at a certain point, was a paid companion for a woman down in Denver, and is buried by the woman in Fairmont Cemetery. All these ladies are buried in Fairmont.
With headstones?
Yeah.
Good.
But like some, they don't have their regular names.
Yeah.
I mean, they have their real names as opposed to like, Jenny Rogers, I think, is Leah Redding, and Maddie Silks is something else. And Lou Bunch is Louisa Bunch, I believe it says on her headstone. The madam side of the equation, there were fines to pay. So whenever City Hall needed money, they would like round up the girls or find some violations so they were paying. They had to pay licenses to run a brothel. They had to pay licenses to sell alcohol. They had to pay graft for the beef cop. They had the expenses of the house or the brothel to run. There were girls to manage and customers to handle. So they had a lot going on. These were actually business women. I mean, if you were like a drunk or an addict or not fiscally inclined, you couldn't have survived in this business. Let's see. So here is May Phelps. She was a Trinidad madam. She liked to have her picture taken. And so she always looks impeccable. She is Trinidad's most well-known madam. During the 1900s, she actually had about 10 women working for her, which is considered a large-sized house. It was at 228 Santa Fe Avenue, which is now Country Club Drive. So like kind of cleaned it up. But what's really interesting about May, she kind of displays the feistiness of a person getting pulled into court. And once during one of her court appearances, the attorney, Jamie McKeough, demanded whether she operated a public house. And she's like, you ought to know, you've been there enough. You know, so whether the guy had really been there or not, who knows, but she wasn't really going to take a bunch of pushback. She also started the Trinidad Madams Association. In 1910, she actually rerouted the trolley line, so that's a piece of political maneuvering that is wild. So they wanted the nearby mining camps to come through the Brothel district, so the trolley line got rerouted, made it easier for customers. And then she also was instrumental in building a place called the Madam's Rest Home, as the locals called it, out in an area near Jensen, what they call Jensen. And that operated into the 1930s. So all of her photographs are taken by Altman in Trinidad. So he didn't really, he had like all sorts of people who were his customers. He didn't really discriminate. So this is a Colorado actress. And she looks kind of actress-like. She's definitely interesting. And next to her, you can see the white of a brothel gown. So these women wore like kind of like Lance of Austria nightgowns, so they didn't have the plumes, they didn't have the fine silks, the madams did. And they might buy very expensive dresses of which the madam would loan them money. Then they were in hock to the madam. And they couldn't just leave if they owed her money just because they didn't like things. So it was kind of a usurious situation.
Can I ask a question about
Sure.
that? What was the percentage that the madam got versus?
50%
Usually
usually.
50.
Okay.
50-50.
50-50, but the girls, it was like the company store.
Yeah.
Oh.
So, let's see, I did have these.
A piece of what I was going to talk about when I was in Alaska, and they go up as exotic dancers and whatnot, and then they were slaves to the club owners, and the club was called the Great Alaska Bush Company. But anyway, so one of the gals that came to my clinic brought me her G-string. Nothing to it. She said, I just want, and I didn't tell this yesterday, she said, I want you to know, she said, how much do you think they charge me for it? And I said, well, maybe it's got $5 worth of material, and maybe 5 minutes of sewing. And I said, you know, maybe there's $10 in it, 25, 35. They charged her $179 for this G-string and demanded that she have it. And she had to have their G-string.
I believe you.
So, you know, this is 80s.
So what we're passing around now, so thank you for bringing that up, that is an awesome job, are fake brothel tokens.
I've seen them.
And what happened is, like, the man would make the arrangement with the madam to pay for the woman's services. She would take the cash. She would give him a brothel check to give to the girl. They'd settle up in the morning because she didn't want the girls handling money because the house wouldn't get their cut. So here's 3 prostitutes. Far side is Laura Bullion, who worked as a prostitute, but she was also the girlfriend of one of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid's Wild Bunch. It's the guy called the Tall Texan. This is a mugshot of her. The one in the middle is out of a book I have on white slave trade. So this is a posed photo. She's supposed to be regretting her choices in life. And this one here is a picture from eBay. And I was betting on this too. I think that ended up going for $250.
Wow.
So I thought, like, in the scheme of life, it kind of made me happy she could still command such good prices, but I wasn't going to pay it. So.
And my observation on her is what a nubile young woman she was, and why she was probably very desirable, because they probably were selling her as a virgin.
Right. So there's all sorts of trades. Now, the girl side of the equation was the hierarchy. So if she was young and desirable, she could make it into a parlor house, which would have the best of the furniture, the best of the foods, the best working conditions and safety. Second rate was kind of regular brothel. And I mean, it was good enough. There is safety in number in this game. And you know, if you became addicted to drugs or alcohol, the finer establishments obviously didn't want you in them because you were more of a liability. You kind of start sliding down and you'd end up in a crib behind a saloon or whatever. And that's kind of actually where things got more dangerous. Time was not a friend. It's a position you age out of, you know. And unless you were good with money and you had kept your wits about you, and if you were good with math, you could become a madam if you could get like enough investors or whatever to do what you wanted. They did become pregnant, they did have disease, they did have children. In my book, Market Street Madam, I ended up writing that book because I was driving with a friend over the viaducts of Denver, which is no longer there, and she's like, there's bad blood in my dad's family, and I'm like, what? And she's like, his great aunt was a second-rate madam, and her nieces were hooking for her, and I thought, whoa, that's really interesting, you know, because I'm from Golden. I mean, we didn't have stuff like that. I was like, wow, this is so fabulous. But, you know, and then I started saying I was going to write a book, and I had to wait for relatives to die, because during the Depression, prostitutes had food. So when these large families couldn't feed themselves, send them over to the whorehouse, they give them food. There's a lot of loyalty. So these poor people pass away, and I'm like, great, let's talk. And they're like, we don't know anything, because they were worried that I was actually going to write a book. So I did write a book, and I gave them the book, and they read it, and they loved it. And then they're like, did we tell you the one about, like, whatever? And I'm like, no, the book is written. We should have had this conversation before. So it's kind of funny. And now I'm like Ancestry.com for the Ryan family, because I get these emails every now and again going, are you one of our relatives? And I'm like, no, but I know some of your relatives. So, like, I kind of hook them up, so that's good. There's the threat of addiction. When these girls would buy expensive clothing, which they would, they'd spend their money. The madam would front them the money. She would charge them interest on stuff, you know, whether they used it or not. So in time, they would be held like really liable to the house. So you couldn't just leave because you didn't like something. So threat of addiction. They didn't really have friends or close associations because everybody was competition. So that's kind of unfortunate. Drugs for cosmetic purposes is one of the health hazards. Belladonna out of the nightshade family dilated the pupil to give a woman bedroom eyes. Also called blindness when used too often. I mean, how often is too often? I don't know. Arsenic wafers contributed to the all-important pale complexion. And to keep your face fresh, some woman coated the face with opium overnight, followed by a brisk wash of ammonia in the morning. For the treatment of sparse eyebrows and eyelashes, mercury was often recommended as a nightly eye treatment. Ooh. Steve's a chemist. He's like, well, that is the worst idea I've ever heard of. So, anyhow. Drugs of choice in the day, laudanum, morphine, opium, marijuana, and cocaine. A lot of patent medicines were 17 to 44% a mixture of alcohol and whatever. Godfrey's cordials, Feely's pneumatic mixture, contained morphine. Laudanum is a liquid derivative of opium mixed with whiskey or other spirits. Morphine and glycerin cured sore throats. Morphine and cocaine cured nasal drip and hay fever, and opium works great for insomnia. So you could be really drugged up. In Walsenburg, I found this snippet. You couldn't find a whole lot about prostitution in Walsenburg. I mean, we know what happened probably over the Elks Club, you know, I went to see the site and all that. Here they're saying that there are not to be any opium joints. Okay, so they wouldn't really have this in a city ordinance if they weren't experiencing a need to have an ordinance over it. So this is just telling people you'll get fined not less than $50 or more than $100 for an opium joint. Here are Sanborn fire maps. The one on the right side is Trinidad, the one on the left side is Santa Fe. Pueblo. And they also had places on Union Street. So, I mean, originally when the towns were settled, women just settled wherever they wanted to do. As time went on, more respectable people moved in. They tried to limit the contagion, or whatever you want to say, into a specific district. So
I have a question, excuse me again.
Oh, good.
The opium ordinance, do you know about the date of that article?
About 1910.
Okay, thank you.
1910. Yeah. And here's May Phelps again, looking lovely, ravishing. I mean, she had the wherewithal to have the dresses and the photographs taken. So. Now this is the family I wrote about, the Ryans. They are not good-looking people, but this was their family business, okay? So the one in the middle is Elizabeth Jane Ryan Wallace. They ran saloons, but she was also a procuress. Her daughter Annie, which is the larger woman on the right side, started out as a prostitute and became a madam in her own right, and Julia and Mona were her two sisters, and they were prostitutes.
And where did they live?
Denver. Denver, yeah. I think I found traces of Elizabeth Jane in Nebraska. I think that is where she started out. But there's also a niece named Pearl, which is like instrumental in the book. And I don't want to give any spoilers, but a really bad thing happened to Pearl, and it was not in the newspapers because of who they were. That said, the Ryans managed to control Market Street very well. There were also sons born to them that had saloons and were procurers, and they'd always have policemen working as the bartenders. The whole thing was shady, shady, shady. And if something happened, they could usually put a lid on it pretty fast. And so even though they were second rate, they were smart enough to keep their names out of the newspapers.
And was there a father, too, of these girls that was alive, or what, do you know anything about that?
Nobody knows what happened to him.
Okay.
They just think he left. I think they started out, they were started when they came to Colorado into the mining camps. And in my book, I have them running away with another prostitute, which is like just a family story that they have. Some Chinese prostitute, which really didn't make the Irish Catholic one happy. And then when we were doing the research, when she got arrested, she put down for her religion nothing, and that really bothered them. So it was just kind of interesting to see, 100 years later, how bothered people could be by certain things. The non-religion thing really bothered them. The Chinese lady, but no, he just kind of disappeared. He went somewhere, never came back. Here's an eBay photo of a prostitute. This is Val Bernard's brothel in Denver. These are Denver prostitutes. They are dressed up in their finest to get their picture taken. The guys behind them, we didn't really have pimps in Denver. This was a woman-run business. The women did the procuring for the most part. The women ran the brothels. These guys might be divert foot traffic from the train station over into the red light district for employment. But, here they are, and the one grabs the woman's breast. So it's just kind of, it's sad, because this was probably a big deal for them. They're drinking.
Did they have security? Did they have men?
They had a guy called a professor, usually, who would play the piano.
Okay.
And what would happen, though, the bartender would usually, if they had a bartender, he'd be somewhat of a bouncer. The women were armed, so if some woman was screaming, the women would come in to help. That's why it was safer to be in a brothel or with a group of women as opposed to the crypts in the back where, people are out of their mind drunk. You scream, nobody cares. They're too drunk, right? So.
And most of them had a cot that was on the take that was part of it.
Sure.
If worse came to worse, he might stumble upstairs to see what was going on. But
well, and depending on who was paying what bill for him. Right. I mean, the whole thing was so corrupt. It was just bad. Pueblo's original vice district. South Pueblo got incorporated into mainstream Pueblo, but South Pueblo was wide open in the 1880s. Their popular establishments were the Bucket of Blood, which was also known as the Bella Union or the Central. That was in the 100 block of South Union, and they have placards out front if you go on Union Street, just like walking down the street. They've got the hanging tree where it used to be and stuff like that. Newspaper accounts were both horrified and amused with the goings-on in the red light district.
which are so well done in Dobbs's book.
Yeah, she's really put together a good collection of it. Causes of death, disease, suicide was prevalent, drug overdose, and violence. This is a stage photograph of a raid in Denver on Market Street. They actually did this, so all the money from all these licenses and fees and graft went into City Hall. One time they decided they were poor, so they're like, oh my God, there's prostitution in Denver. So they do a raid, pull all these girls in at 10:30 in the morning. Well, half of them were still drunk from the night before. They were halfway dressed. They tried to give them coffee. They wanted beer. The whole thing was like a nightmare. Finally, people started sending them food over about noon. And by 5:30, all the jails were cleared out and business went on as usual. So whenever City Hall wanted money, they'd go to the red light district. That's why Colorado didn't really clean up prostitution until relatively late in the day. This is a poor unfortunate who is deceased in Denver, probably from drugs. Whoops. This is a murder victim. I think it's a woman based on the shoes. But that's really what a brothel interior looked like, so it's not, I don't know, but it's a sad photograph. And here's remaining traces today. The House of Mirrors is still on 1942 Market Street if you're there. That was Jenny Rogers, the classy one. And these are busts of people. And so Jenny Rogers being the classy one, I thought women always kept their clients secret. Well, she decided she wanted a fancier brothel built. Steve's just laughing. And she went to her wealthier customers and said, do you want to build me a brothel? Well, most people probably didn't want to build her a brothel. So the ones that said no and stuck to their guns, she had their likenesses carved in sandstone and put in the eaves of the brothel. And Denver was small then, so when you're driving by, you'd be like, I didn't know Joe was one of Jenny's customers. So, and they're there for posterity. This is a crib in Leadville by the Leadville Old Town Museum or City Museum. It's in the yard there, so they just had a bed, stove, and a washstand. This is Salida, Laura Evans's properties. So this is in the 1950s. She got booted out of Leadville because she sided with the mine owners as opposed to the mine strikers, because her customers were the mine owners. She smuggled in their payroll, breaking a strike, and she was, I'm sure, respectfully requested to leave Leadville. So she came down to Salida, and this is what her buildings look like today. They're still there. These ones are now apartments, and it has like something built on top, which I don't really know how to explain, but because you see it's not there in the 50s. So maybe they built it and just made it look old. I don't know. So that part's strange, but yep. So that's Salida. And there again, Altman photos, Miss May Phelps.
What nationality do you think she was?
Oh, she was actually Irish. I think she's first generation Irish. Or first generation American from Irish descent, shall we say. So there we go.
Was she related to the Denver Broncos?
I don't think so. I don't think so. You never know. You never know. That's the problem with Colorado. It's like you start talking to people, and if your family's been around long enough, we're just like, whoa. You know, like sometimes we kind of know a little bit more than we're supposed to. But that's a good question. And every time I see the Phelps, like construction company, like maybe, I have no idea. So a lot of times they did change their names. They moved to a different city, shave a few years off their age. There's some pictures of her where she said she was like 45, and by that point she's really 65. And they can kind of figure it out, and the math doesn't add up. But she was just doing what the girls did. So when I was trying to make this all a nonfiction book, Market Street Madam, I couldn't do it because I'd almost get a glimpse of a person and I could kind of follow them, and all of a sudden their names would change and their age would go down. It was impossible because they did not want their families to know what they were doing. So that is my portion of the presentation.
Wow, that was great.
And that's it.
Can I ask another question?
Sure.
What was the lifespan of these?
I would say really it was about, that's like a very good question. I'd say it's about 35 years old. So most of the people really started hooking about like 19 to 24. I think you were still like in pretty good shape, hopefully, if you didn't start doing drugs or drinking too much. And then it started going down. And so if you didn't have the wherewithal or the acumen to become a madam, you find a lot of people in their 30s were starting to commit suicide. And so if you go into Colorado historic newspapers, you know, you can just go in there and type prostitute, and it's very interesting to see what comes up. And a lot of them are overdose attempts. And so 35, you're kind of getting up there. Jenny Rogers, I think, lived to 70. She succumbed to Bright's disease. Maddie Silks, who was a madam, I think, actually made it to 80. She died in the 50s. 80, 90. I don't know.
I'm trying to think of what Bright's disease is, but I think
Something to do with your kidneys.
that's what I'm remembering, and I think that probably had to do with some of the potions that she was using.
Well, I'm thinking that potions aren't good. So
What was the highlight, the apex of the brothel movement, and when did it decline and be illegal? I mean, really illegal.
It's really illegal, so it depends where you were.
Yeah.
Okay, so up in Denver, when World War II started, 1914, the brothels fell out of fashion.
World War I, you mean?
Yeah, sorry, World War I. 1914, there was a women's Christian temperance movement, so as more women came in with families, they really objected to these women. This is why there aren't that many traces of them, because they were arch enemies, you know, so they're conquering, they're tearing down their structures, you know, type of thing. So when World War I came, they wanted healthy troops. Red light districts did not promote good health, right? So they started closing that all down. Then it came back slightly about like 1919, and then it went down again in the early 20s. The red light district in Denver was dispersed, so they went out to the suburbs. They went to Logan Street. They weren't on Market Street. They're still there. The women never go away. They had a call service to the Brown Palace Hotel. I mean, there's stuff. In Silverton, I think they didn't clean up prostitution there until the 50s. Leadville, it was definitely the 70s, maybe the early 80s. So a lot of the stuff still kind of went on. And so when the gambling was coming, like Leadville was getting upset that they were like, do you want to do gambling? And they're like, good Lord, you know, that was in the 80s. They're like, we just got this place cleaned up. You want to bring in gambling? Yeah, I don't think so, but yeah.
So prohibition really didn't affect the prostitution business?
Well, they were dispersed. Annie Ryan, the picture back here, if I can get that far, she was a Madivan at that point. She actually was the first female in Colorado arrested for bootlegging during Prohibition.
Yeah. Wow.
She had a friend named Blind Sadie who was blind, you know, and the police do a run right on a brothel, not on Market Street, but I think in Logan Streets, Logan and 16th now. Run into the room. Blind Sadie's laying in the bed. They're like, ma'am, you gotta get up. You gotta go to the jail. She's like, oh, I'm old and feeble. They picked her up, and there were all the bottles under her. She was holding up these bottles. That case went all the way up to Colorado Supreme Court. And she had really lawyered up, and it got dismissed.
Wow.
Yep.
And that was what year about?
That one would be like in 1929.
Okay.
And then she actually murdered her common-law husband and went down to the penitentiary, and instead of being there for a long time, she got out after about 5 months.
Blind lady?
No, Annie Ryan, who like the large girl. She's not blind, sorry. Blind Sadie. They're large. I mean, they had food.
Yeah.
No, they could belt. They could beat them.
Yeah, they were tough.
So, yeah.
Any sense of how old they are?
In this picture, you know, it's really kind of scary. So I think Liza Jane would probably be about 50 there. I mean, to me, she looks like 70. Yeah, the one sitting down.
Yeah.
Right, so she was their mother. I think Annie there is probably about 20. Annie turned out to be kind of like, as she got older, she became thinner and more beautiful. It was a very strange thing. It's kind of counterintuitive. And these two girls would have been like, you know, 19, 18. They were probably born out of wedlock. They had 2 saloons, or well, they had 3 saloons at least. One was Ryan's, one was the Wallace's. So who the Wallace person is, I don't know, but you can see like those 2 girls on the left side, their last name is Wallace, while Annie is Ryan. So, and they're all her daughters. So it's a very turbulent life.
So was the connection to the lady in your book in Leadville, how was she connected to him?
Oh, so I took
Poetic
Sadie. Poetic license. I wanted to use the Fortune Club in Victor as a Leadville place because Leadville had a wild red light district, and so did Denver. So I just kind of mushed them together. Poetic license. It suited my purposes, so I fished.
Really readable terminology I hadn't known before, you know?
Yep. Yeah, it's kind of fun.
Fabulous. That's fabulous. Thank you.
So it's Andy.
So, and I'm going to sit down because I sit. It's kind of interesting because after we did this yesterday, I realized that there could be a different lead-in title. And it kind of works with the fact that, and what does this have to do with anything? Taught a culture class, and culture is the traditional embroidery of northern New Mexico and southern Colorado, and learned the culture embroidery. But I build what I taught just because I'm concerned about appreciation and appropriation as a contemporary approach to a traditional craft. Kind of what we figured out yesterday, with Randy doing the historical piece, I kind of do a very contemporary piece. And you'll see why I say it's kind of contemporary. I'm going to start with my soft place in my heart for ladies of the evening. Came from my dad. And it came from my dad when he was just a young boy. And the flood of 21 in Pueblo wiped out the Union Avenue, B Street, all that area, well, all of southern Pueblo got wiped out. And my grandfather had a Army surplus store right on the corner of Union and C Street. And he went across the street when the flood waters were raising and stood on top of a car, cut a hole in the ceiling with his pocket knife, and pulled two of his friends or two of his employees went with him. He was able to pull one up, the other one got washed away in the flood. And they had moved to Pueblo when my dad was 4. My dad was born in 1950. So they moved to Pueblo in 1919 for my grandfather's health. The dust of eastern Kansas or western Kansas, I guess, was getting to him, and they thought they would have better health. My grandmother had a cousin named Albert Stubblefield that lived in Pueblo that was the only relative, but they thought getting him to Colorado he could be healthier. Well, when he was pulled his friend up, his delicate heart couldn't handle it, and the grief of losing his friend and not being able to say, he died a year later. He died in 1922, so he died when my dad was 7. Left my grandmother with 3 little kids. My dad was the youngest. And this is the story that I had learned from my dad, was when he was 10 years old, he went down to the newspaper in Pueblo, which at that time was Star Journal Chieftain, and talked to Robert Hogue, that was the editor. And why a 10-year-old got to talk to the editor, I don't know, but my dad was pretty neat. So he said, there isn't much somebody my age can do to help the family, but I need to help my family. We're struggling. My mom's a widow. I've got, these 2 siblings. Could I have a paper route? And he said, well, you're kind of young, but we use younger boys to be the newsboys in Pueblo. We'll give you a try. He said, I'm going to give you a north side route, and they lived there on the north side. They lived at 9th and Greenwood. And he said, and if you do well, he said, I've got something in mind for you. So apparently Daddy did well, and Robert Hogue called him back in, and he said, okay, you've done a good job. And he said, now I want to offer you something. He said, I'm going to give you the best paper route in Pueblo. He said, it's somebody that always pays their bills, they pay in cash, they're going to tip you, they're going to love you, you're never going to want for food or clothing, you're going to have 100 other mothers. I'm giving you the red light district. So Daddy had B Street and Union Avenue, all the upstairs, for a number of years. And that, like I said, that's where I came with the soft spot for that, because he had shoes, he had coats, they'd send home food, they would tip him generously. And his soft place for the prostitutes carried over to my heart. Now, I would like to know more of the stories. You listen, but I didn't listen well. And I remember my grandmother, who became a WCTUer, would, oh, Howie, how can you? And my mother would pretend like she didn't hear what he was saying. But, so I always grew up thinking, the good-hearted woman story. You fast forward, and I became a nurse practitioner in women's health, and started in Colorado Springs. Well, actually, I started over in the valley because that doesn't have anything to do with anything. Back in Colorado Springs, as a relatively new, nurse practitioner roles were brand new. In fact, they called us physician extenders at that point in time. And there was a program between CU School of Medicine and Planned Parenthood to train women to be able to do so much of the women's health that they used physicians for before that didn't need physicians. It was really a role that a nurse practitioner or a physician extender could have. So I was the low man on the totem pole at the clinic in Colorado Springs that was on West Colorado. And the low person on the totem pole kind of got to do all the infection checks because that was kind of the yuckiest of the yuck. So I got the yuckiest of the yuck. And what I learned pretty rapidly was a lot of the women that I was seeing for my infection checks were sex workers. And they were neat ladies. They all had stories. They had hard luck stories. But what came out of it is they explained to me that in Colorado Springs, and Colorado Springs prostitution has never slowed down. I mean, you know, the fact that it's got the military base there, and you know, TV in the last 2 years keeps talking about the massage parlors, and not necessarily do we have, you know, brick bordellas, but the sex industry in Colorado Springs is alive and well. And now I haven't been in the Springs since the late 70s, but it was alive and well. And what my ladies ended up telling me about was if they didn't have a health certificate, if they were arrested for prostitution, they could be thrown in jail and be on a health hold for 48 hours, and until they got back a clean STD check. So we cooked up this idea. What if I went to the police department and we agreed on something that they would come in every 2 weeks and have a health check? I would send, you know, all the tests off, and we would have something that would be signed off, so if they were arrested, they would have in their hand a clean bill of health. And the police chief was all over that. He said, they don't belong in jail. He said, I don't want them in the jail. They take up space. He said, that's not where they belong. So make that work. And I had a wonderful boss, and he said, you know, how would you like to open your own clinic? But we need a clinic down in Security, which is right off the edge of the Army base down there in the Springs. And I said, I'd love to. He said, give you 2 months salary, you could go open the clinic, it can't cost anything, you have to have free rent, you got to get it remodeled, we'll give you the supplies, but go for it. And my advantage was my ladies were all paying customers, and they followed me down there. So I was able to open my clinic and make it self-sustaining because I had the population of ladies. And I had some that I really, really cared a lot about. And one of them was this beautiful cafe au lait woman. She had legs that went clear up to her chin. She looked like a model. And she was just a gorgeous, gorgeous woman. And she would come in for her health check. And when we moved down to Security, couldn't see this when I was on West Colorado, but she'd drive up in the back of this white car. It wasn't a limo, but a long white car. And she'd motion to the guy to just wait for her. She'd sashay in. She'd say to my receptionist, now honey, you have the order ready when I come out. And the order was, we sold condoms in 10, or gave them away, in 10 to us and a grocery sack. And her order was 10 sacks of 10 condoms. So she would go have the 100 condoms for her 2 weeks. What was interesting in working with this population that I was just fascinated with, and this was before the research was probably going on, but the research wasn't out. I saw such a high rate of abnormal pap smears in my ladies. And it just, nuns do not get cervical cancer. The younger you are, the more partners you have, and this is research that came out later, the greater the risk of cervical cancer. And I was determined in my own mind that I think it's caused by a virus. I think it's caused by exposure, which the science caught up with, you know. But my beautiful friend Pat did a pap smear and it came back abnormal. And we would have a colposcopy clinic, and that was back on West Colorado, and I used Air Force stocks to moonlight my clinics. And she'd come in, and first of all, she couldn't come in. She said, you know, you got to do something different about this, honey. Your clinics are all scheduled in working women's hours, you know, my evening clinics. And so twice she came in and chickened out and left. And one time she came in and I took her clothes so she couldn't leave. And she did. She had invasive cancer, and she died of cancer. And she thought it was karmic. She didn't want it treated. She said, you know, that's how it is. So I was real fond of her. And then another little one that is the saddest story, and it's actually a story of about 3, but they all kind of blend together. But this little gal came in, and she was 15, 16 at that point in time, and had a baby in her arms, and the baby was just the saddest little thing. Little tiny, scrawny blue arms, and she had this little pink ruffly dress, and little shoes that were too big, and socks with lace around them, and the baby had the high mewling cry that you hear of a child that's really in distress. And she came in, and she's all tear stained, has this little baby. And part of the story, came to Colorado Springs, followed her boyfriend from Kansas. She came from a respectable family in Kansas, followed him out there to Colorado Springs because she was pregnant and he was in the military, and he had nothing to do with her. And somehow it ended up going to court, and he had all his Army buddies testify that they'd all slept with her, and she'd never been with anybody but him, and I'm sure that was true. So the whores down on Veta took her in, and her little tear-stained story, they were so good to her until she got so pregnant that she couldn't work. She worked right alongside of them. And she said, and they had a baby shower for me, and they gave me the baby's little pink outfit, and they gave me a little blue outfit, and a package of diapers, and a mason jar full of quarters. They gave me everything I needed to have a baby. She was so naive, so naive. And she was living in this horrible little apartment. Social services had been called on her because she'd gone out to try and hustle and left the baby, and the baby was crying, and she got the baby back. But when she came to me, she said, you know, I've got something. She said, and the baby was probably 6 weeks old. She said, I had to go back to flat backing. She said, I can't feed my baby, I can't feed me. I had to find a way. And she said, the guy that had been her pimp was so cruel to her. He said, you know, nobody wants a tear-stained, flabby-bellied, stretched out, saggy breast 16-year-old. But we'll see if I can find some business for you. Well, turns out that she actually had gonorrhea. But the saddest piece of it, and I'd written a little story, which I can't find the damn story because I wrote it a long, long time ago. But I used the theme of hush little baby, don't you cry. Mama's going to buy you a diamond ring, and I made it work with all the things that happened with this kind of a compilation of stories. But the final stanza was, hush little baby, don't you cry. If your mama jumps in and drowns, you're going to be the prettiest little baby in town. She handed me the baby so she could go in the exam room, and then she went out the back door, and the Fountain River was right there behind the clinic. She didn't jump in and drown. She came back and got the baby. But that was her intention. She was going to commit suicide. And she said, I knew you would take care of my baby. Of course I would. I used to answer my phone, Sandra's home for stray dogs, cats, and people, you know. But it was, those are the kinds of stories, and that's just one story. You know, that's the real piece of it. I moved to Alaska, and I got to open the first Planned Parenthoods in the state of Alaska. And again, we were going away from any federal funding to total fee for service. So again, I went to the police department in Anchorage and asked if we could do a similar program like I had in the Springs, because they had data and results and it was successful. And they didn't hold them on a health hold, but they thought it was a good idea. They took the business cards and they said, you know, we'll pass out your cards. I think this is a really good service. And oh, I love my ladies in Alaska. And that's how I opened my clinic, both the one in security. Alaska statistics were real similar to the late 1800s statistics, because we were on the tail end of the pipeline. It was the late 70s, early 80s. And there were 10 men for every woman up there. And the women were neat. Whether they were the prostitutes or just the women, Alaska women were neat because they were strong, they were hard workers, a lot of them were laborers, a lot of them were in jobs that had traditionally been male jobs. I had engineers and chemists, but I also had, you know, welders, and loved my ladies in Alaska. But two of my stories from that, well, there was three I told you about. The one that brought me in the G-string that she paid $179 for. A lot of the girls went up to be exotic dancers, and then the exotic dance place owned their soul. Sometimes they would leave and go, didn't have brothels per se, it was massage parlors, it was all massage parlors up there, I think. I don't know, what do I know? But that's my clientele was, and they would go to massage parlors. Occasionally they, because the money was more lucrative, the exotic dance business, they just really kept their souls owed to the company store. So they'd go to the massage parlors and they could earn better money. usually the madame was somebody who had been a working girl herself. And I'm gonna back up and tell you one more story. One of the prettiest, see, I like my pretty ladies, went in the exam room, and she was a high-end prostitute, and she traveled between Anchorage and Honolulu, and she had a practice or a clientele in both places. And she was just this gorgeous bronze lady. So I go in, I poke my head in the exam room because I'm going to do her exam, and she's sitting there cross-legged singing, buff naked. And I said, "Oh, here's the little paper gown for you." She said, "Honey, this is what I sell. Do you think I want to cover it up in paper?" So the other piece that was so fascinating to me, and I can't remember the lady's name, and I tried to find it online, and I'll figure it out again. She called me at the clinic, and she said, "I have a business proposition for you," and told me her name, and she'd just been splashed all over the newspaper in Anchorage. And she had started out this whole path that I told you, came up as a dancer, went to the massage parlor, became a madame, ended up owning a string of massage parlors, took good care of her girls, and I knew her from the girls too, but she became a real estate agent, and she was one of the most successful real estate agents in Anchorage. She knew everybody from different perspectives and different sides, and she was a character. So she called me and said she had a business proposition for me, and I said, "Yes." And she said, "Well, I'll tell you what," she said, "I still need my health checks." And she said, "But I want it to remain very secretive and very anonymous." She said, "This is my criteria. I come at night, there's nobody in the clinic but you and I." She said, "You don't use my real name. If you need to submit any lab tests and whatnot, you use an alias." She said, "I will follow up." And she said, "I will come once a month, maybe twice a month." And she said, "If you can meet all this criteria of taking care of me, I'll give you $500 a visit. And then you can put the $500 in a kitty to take care of the other girls."
Wow.
So for a year and a half, I took care of her. And she'd get out of her car. She looked like Cruella de Vil. She had this white ermine coat that still had black tails on it, and this red, gorgeous, lacquered whore hair, and long fingernails before the long fingernails were a thing. But she wanted to help take care of the girls. So that was one of my favorite stories about Alaska. I tried to do some research about what was going on down here and do some of the historic research, and kind of ran into lots of brick walls. I called Carolyn Newman, who's the local historian, and she gave me a couple stories that I read about that, or learned about, that in Walsenburg, apparently 8th Street was, this is my hotbed of activity, 8th Street was the red light district, and 7th is the main one, going out of town. So 8th is what parallels it to the south. And she said, yeah, there were several institutions on that street. She thought there were several institutions on that street. And she said, in literature, it was referred to as the resort area, which I thought was really fun. So she said, but you need to talk to my son, Bruce Newman, who's the sheriff in Walsenburg. So before I got to talking to Bruce, I called James Baca, who's been a friend of mine that lives on 8th Street and grew up on 8th Street. And I thought, well, James ought to know the streets. He said, I don't really know. He said, I don't know. He said, but let me think. He said, they're on the corner where the park is, the water park's there, in the far corner, the west corner there. He said, there was a institution called the Pavilion. And he said, it was a dance hall and a saloon and a gambling den. And he said, I know that my dad was absolutely appalled at what went on at that place, and forbade my sisters of ever going there because they would get a terrible reputation. And he said my sisters used to crawl out the bedroom window and go over to the Pavilion. So I thought, this was all interesting. And then I called Gerald Durant, who's a local historian that just really knows a lot about that particular area of Walsenburg. And James told me, Carolyn Newman told me, that the only place that was really identifiable as the place was what was above the Eagles Hall there on Main Street. And they had the balcony, so the girls could go out and hunt. The balcony is no bigger than that damn table. It's the littlest balcony I ever saw. But anyway, James said, you know, they're above the eagles, and then he started leading me into things that Bruce Newman confirmed it. Where Safeway is now was a whole bunch of pool halls and gambling dens and saloons and probably other things. And Gerald shared with me, there's a ghost that lives in Safeway and they call her Charlotte because weird things happen in Safeway. And bread falls off the shelf and doors slam and cold breezes, and it's just the checkers and what everybody knows there's a ghost in Safeway, and some of them call her Charlotte. And Gerald was sure that Charlotte was one of the displaced women. So that was kind of fun. So, and then the other thing that I thought were cribs that I learned about in Walsenburg, in fact,
She sent me and some of my friends out looking for them. Like we're scavenging through Walsenburg looking for cribs.
I knew
It was so funny. I couldn't find them. I'm like, I don't get it.
Yeah, there was this building that's right on 7th Street. In fact, I looked at the address. It's 523 7th Street. So,
Right.
but it wasn't, because what I learned, it was a storefront that sits right real close to the store, and he had a duplex that was attached to it. But in the back was 4 or 5, just the size for a bed and maybe a nightstand kind of thing. And I was just sure that it was cribs. But what I learned from Gerald Durant is if you go down the alleys, there's lots of places like that. And those were called batches. And that was for the miners and the railroaders that would come through, the bachelors that only needed a place to sleep. And he said the most reputable families had batches behind their house, and that's what the place is on.
It was good fun though. And my friends like have these horribly broad Texas accents. Is this one of them? Like, everybody's like, that's so loud, guys.
So then I talked to Bruce Newman, the sheriff, and he was really helpful, and he had good stories for me. On 8th Street, on 8th and Albert, and Safeway, the street to the east of Safeway is Albert, and 8th, one block over, there is a 2-story house, and it was originally the Lammy Hospital, just like 1899 was the Lammy Hospital. And when I opened my women's clinic in Walsenburg, one of my other projects, there's no money, just figure it out, was looking for a location for the women's clinic, the outreach clinic. And they said, well, go look at the old Lammy Hospital building. It's empty. And I thought, oh, yeah, maybe that would work. So I go, and I can't remember, somebody was with me. And we go in the old Lammy Hospital, and the downstairs would have been quite suitable because it was set up with exam rooms and waiting room and whatnot. And narrow staircase upstairs. Then there was like 4 small rooms that opened right out off a hallway. Well, they could have been hospital rooms. But I just knew that it had been a brothel. I could feel it in my bones. And I thought, this would be so cool to open a women's clinic that honors women and takes good care of women. The brothel was upstairs. But I didn't know this for a fact until I talked to Bruce Newman. He said, well, you know, the Lammy Hospital was really rumored that there was a lot of things after it wasn't a hospital that went on upstairs. So I think I was right on with that one. One of the stories that he shared that I think is so fun is a woman that had worked at the, and I don't know what the brothel was called above the Eagles, I don't have any idea, but the place above the Eagles with this little tiny balcony. And the lady was banned because she was too old or too tired or too diseased or too something, too mouthy, and they tossed her out of the good brothel. And she went across the street. He said, you know the antique store that's across the street? I go, yeah. And there was a series of them. He said, the one on the corner. I can't believe he didn't connect these dots. And he said, she went over there, and she was so angry with him that she'd see the ladies lounging up on their tiny little balcony, and she'd motion to the men, come over here, you can get it for free. And in times when it was really tough, and she said, come over here, and I'll pay you to pleasure me. And you know what the name of the antique store is? The Fallen Angel. So have no idea whether it's good old Frank Azar's mother ran that, And whether she had an idea, and that's why it's called The Fallen Angel, I don't know, but I just love that story. Another story that he shared with me is the women are cautioned against not falling in love or having a relationship with any of their men. And one of the ladies became kind of a paramour of one of her clients, and the proprietor, and I don't know who the proprietor was, got wind of it and tracked down this person. They were going to make it straight and kill him or threaten him or something, cut off his, I don't know what they were going to do. But anyway, what was interesting about it was he had given the name of another man. So that when they showed up to make things right, they had the wrong person. So just lots of
nonsense.
Yeah. Interesting story. One of my favorite things, one of my other connections, I love making things out of Pendleton, and those of you who know. And this was one of my favorite Pendleton pieces, a vest. And what does this have to do with this whole story? It was up in Portland, Oregon at the Mill End outlet, and this was a discontinued pattern. And I thought it was so beautiful, and I angst over whether I was going to buy the remnant that was cheaper or buy it off the bolt. And I brought it home, made a couple garments out of it. I thought, oh God, I just love this fabric. And so I called back up to get some off the bolt, and the lady that had waited on me said, honey, she said, the bolt's gone. I said, the whole bolt? And she said, yeah, it's the whole bolt. She said, I shipped it out. And she said, and you're going to love where it went. I said, where did it go? She said, they're reupholstering the lounge furniture at the Mustang Ranch in Nevada.
Oh my God.
So I could go and blend in. So tried to find more information out about Veta specifically, not a lot. Talked to Harold, our marshal here. He said, yeah. He said, but I don't know much about it. And he said, everybody says the Veta Inn was the Veta Hotel. It's had 60 names, it's burnt down, and that was sort of the only location that was identifiable. I found a news clipping from one of Nancy, and I didn't get to talk to Nancy Christopherson, but a news clipping from Nancy Christopherson that she puts in the paper that, and this was 1910 or so, that different fines was, you could be fined for up to $150 for tying your horse to an ornamental fence. But the fine for private prostitution, and I'm not sure what that is, I mean, it kind of sounds like it may have occurred out of your own home kind of thing, was just $10 to $15. So, Harold also told me that the miners that were up at Oakdale and the mining camps with men, they had armed guards to keep them from coming into town here. So, don't know whether that's true. But Harold said, now you need to go meet Dick Jameson. And he's over here at the Veta Village now. And you're going to love Dick, and he's going to love telling you stories. So I went this last week and met with Dick, and what a cutie. And sharp, he's in his 90s. He remembers names and dates and places, and wasn't as helpful as I hoped, other than he said, of course you've read What's a Nice Girl Do Like You Doing a Place Like This. Of all the research I did in the books, that's not one that had come up. And Randy has the book. Yeah,
I
it's
provided
the paper.
it.
Yeah.
Take a look if you're interested in this area.
Yeah, I kind of put my books that I didn't read all of them, and I think Google's going to love this algorithm of me with prostitute. Oh, this is so fun. So I'm trying to find things, I'm trying to research, and I put prostitutes, I guess, Orfano County, Colorado. The second thing that comes up is employment opportunities with the county. So I called Carl Young, who's the county administrator, and said, I was doing some research about job opportunities, Carl, and I want you to know that the second one that came up for Orfano County, when I typed in prostitution, I just wondered if you were hiring.
Did either of you find any connection between prostitution and organized crime?
Oh, Christ, yes.
Okay.
Do you?
Not really.
Hmm.
No, because I was doing the earlier stuff, so like I said, it was really a women's game at that point, so it wasn't the mafia, it wasn't men.
And I think growing up in Pueblo with such a mafioso mentality, they ran all the games.
Yeah.
They ran all the games in town. So I don't know, but that just,
I mean, I know women supported like gamblers and stuff, but I don't know that it was organized. It was just bad choices, some more bad choices coming down the road.
so I am so fascinated with, you know, and I've been fascinated my entire life. But one of the books that an elderly lady out in Honey said, well, you've read Honeyville, haven't you? And I said, no. And she said, oh, you've got to read Honeyville. This is the neatest book. It's all about Trinidad. And it's a prostitute who becomes friends with a society lady, but more so than just the story of prostitution and friendships in Trinidad. It's all about the Ludlow massacre and the unions and the strikers and the scabs. It is so damn interesting.
Is it a novel or is it?
It's a novel.
It's a novel.
Yeah, yeah. I ordered, you know, one of those little $3.99 book places, but the perceptions and I just enjoyed everything about it. And one of the things I thought was interesting was they were saying her wealthy little young friend is, she said, after all, I'm freer than most women and freer than any wife, and I have money of my own. A wife doesn't. A husband can beat and rape his wife, and there's nothing she can do to prevent it. If a man beats me or rapes me, it's against the law. And even if it weren't here in Trinidad, we girls have friends who can make his life a misery. I have freedom, and one day I will say nothing and stop this work altogether and do what I've always planned. So, feeling that it was actually a position of power. So, can't recommend this book enough.
Who's the author, Sandy? Do you know?
A lady by the name of Daisy Waugh, W-A-U-G-H.
Local here or local? Do you know where she? Anything about her?
No, I don't.
Okay.
Part of the whole book was based on The Nice People of Trinidad by this Max Eastman, and it was a series of newspaper articles that she's actually got referenced here in the back. I just have enjoyed this so much. Loaned it to my buddy Sandy here, and she agreed that, you know, it's a page turner. You stay up later than you intend to and get up when you don't want to finish the book. So just enjoyed it. And it's so much of our local history. One of the union organizers that the young society woman becomes involved with, they have a liaison that is inappropriate and unholy in the eyes of everybody. The union organizer isn't supposed to get involved with anybody, and she is of society, but they come up to Walsenburg to rent a room. So anyway, it's a great read.
Great.
So that's kind of my take and spiel on my ladies and the things that I've enjoyed, and I really enjoyed working with that population. They were good women. They had hard luck stories, sad stories, and some of them, like my beautiful little poem sitting that didn't cover up with paper or anything that she sells. You know, there are a lot of really strong women.
Wow.
So I have a question. I mean, you refer to the Eagles, which is the term organization,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So was that always the Eagles? And no, okay.
Yeah.
So when this was going on, what was it?
You know, I don't know. And there's a wonderful man named, it doesn't make any difference, Tom, that worked in the post office, that is the manager of the Eagles now. And they said, you know, if you would call Tom, that he probably can fill you in on some of the history. So, you know, we started this first of the year or so, and I have a couple other things I do besides looking up whores.
Yeah.
Or looking at whores for a lot of years.
Browser histories are really interesting.
Yeah.
It's like, good Lord, what are these people
I would-
up to?
And I'm really going to keep on seeing what else I can find out. So then I get them real fascinated.
Well, thank you for coming,
Yeah,
everyone.
Thank you.
Did you mention about the price of whiskey and the price of beers? What were the women earning a day?
It depends how pretty they were. It depends what their establishment was. So I've seen some places, some people can make $25 in assignation, so that'd be 25 times 25, so that's pretty good money. The Homestead House in Cripple Creek swears that they got $250 a night. I don't believe it, because that would be like, you know, the hundreds of thousands. I mean, you know, and they're like, well, it was the mining bosses. I mean, we had a lot of money, but that's like a real lot of money. And women who are far gone, like addicted, about 10 cents in the Blue Road, so.
Did you get a lot of your information from the Denver Public Library, or where was your major research?
A lot of it from the Denver Public Library. Clark Seacrest's Hell's Bells is a very excellent book. The one that I brought from Brothel was also good, that has prices. So, I mean, there's stuff out there, but it wasn't organized, so you just kind of go in historical, you know, the Colorado historic newspapers and just look and see what it pulls up and what you do. And plus I knew the people related to the Ryans, so they had some hereditary knowledge.
Wow, amazing.
That was the 10 books that I kind of perused.
Great. Great. Is Honey House?
How are you?
Honeyville.
Honeyville, thank you. Oh, yeah.
That's awful house, that's,
I
Oh,
know that.
really?
Yeah.
Where is it?
It's on South Main,
South Main?
yeah.
Is there a sign? Yeah, I know where, but yeah, I've been, so like
You
on
want to
Mount
know
Princeton.
post office?
No, but I'll go one.
It's a duplex, it's in the store.
Do you have kind of a courthouse? Is that
Yeah,
your?
I know where the courthouse is.
Honeyville,
Honeydale's mine.
Courthouse, two to the.
And the rest of these are all
All right.
library books.
Yeah, and
No,
they're redoing it, aren't
maybe
They
not.
did redo it.
they? They did redo it.
I'll check it out.
Yeah, just sold it.
No, these are,
But, yeah.
There was a brothel that went for sale up in Leadville, and they wanted like a lot of money, and
Oh,
then I
Richie
was
got
checking
into
the
that?
records, and it
Yeah.
only sold for like 55,000, so I don't know if somebody's
Thank
kids
This
got
one
it.
went for,
It's been for a million, just
Million, I
recently,
think.
but it's been redone.
but it's been redone.
This
I
thing
think there's
took
actually a
place.
sign in the front that says this is a-
oh, shit.
Thanks for that. I'm so gonna go check that out and see.
They're just a single story building.
I mean, a lot of them weren't as big as you'd expect. I expected like big,
Oh, yeah.
not necessarily. Denver had some, but like, you know, really most places had 6, 4, 6, so many fellows over 10.
You know, when my dad talked about it being there when he was little, they loaned
By the way, we're having a budget meeting tomorrow. Did you see the sign?
I'll tell you,
The
my
Washington
father
Post.
was,
Is it
this.
seven?
Okay.
It's
And when I
that,
was,
yeah, from
in
the
high school,
Okay.
we had the Bible.
Yeah, no, we have to
And
get
one
it
night we're
from.
going around,
And Nikki's
and
gonna play.
another person who had
Oh,
recently moved,
I'm sorry.
Right.
who was a mechanic at garage,
No, I
was a
saw it.
younger guy. And somehow the conversation
So
turned
did you
to
like
prostitution.
Right.
You must have been up and down Spenard.
Oh, yeah.
all
My-
over the place.
My clinic was in one of the residencies.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
We got the tour of.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
I never get stuff like that.
That was in the seventies.
How's
Yeah,
that?
that's what I said, yeah, this is like-
I've been like that whole Pioneer place, that I forget what her name was, you know, and somebody was in there, and it's like, they still had like the high stage and stuff. It took a long time to think.
I ended up buying
It
a
really did.
house
So
and
it's
we
just
were
like,
gonna
you
have
know, in the
to-
mining
I had
kids, it was just part of
good
the
friend, a
culture.
bunch of carpenters.
But that's interesting, good for you, oh, how interesting. Oh, cool.
It
Cool.
was a very interesting talk. Thank you.
Well, thank you for coming. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, these are books.
Oh, really?
This one was a finalist on the Colorado Book Awards 2 years ago for, it's the dark history of Colorado. It's kind